Hello! Welcome back to Brenda's Books. I am so happy you have come back for Season 3. This season, I will be narrating for you a fantasy romance titled Queen Andraya. Now, this season will be slightly unique, at least from my perspective, because I will essentially be writing it as I go. Now, the first draft of this novel is already written, but whenever I go through a book the second time, it's never really the same book at all. So, you will probably be discovering what happens next in the story just shortly after I do. So, it should be a fun journey. Anyway, without further ado, here is the very first chapter of Queen Andraya. Here we go. Chapter 1. Council in Chaos. Dressed in bold red, adorned with colorful jewels, Queen Andraya lifted her elegant raven head, scanning the stern faces of the noblemen, fully clad in silk black suits. The lot of them argued and bantered with wild gestures, causing the long silver table they sat at to wobble back and forth. Are these noblemen or a pack of dogs? The queen thought. She sat at the head of the table. Her heart pounded and her palms trickled with sweat underneath her silk black gloves. Beside her, Chancellor Dolian Ram stood, and all fell silent. His chiseled jaw moved with his bobbing dark hair and expressive shady eyes. As you can see, Her Majesty is officially out of mourning. We would like to welcome her to her first Island Coalition meeting as the head crown of Chaldrea. It is now her duty to direct all such assemblies. He glared at Andraya out of the corner of his eye. What a pleasure, he said, with subtle disdain as he took his seat. The room remained an uncomfortable silence. Andraya realized she preferred the bantering. The young queen stood. She swallowed hard. I will not venture to create preamble to this council. We will hear each kingdom's trading terms without delay, beginning with Lord Bartholomew Bobbins. She then sat in her silver chair, keeping her back as straight as possible. Thank you, Your Majesty, Lord Bartholomew said, as he stood to address the council. His boyish face reddened as he smiled at Queen Andraya. He raked a hasty hand through his dirty blonde hair and pushed up his spectacles as he held a thin paper out in front of him to read. He coughed a few times before he spoke. Concerning the Kingdom of Chaldrea's request to use our ships for transporting lumber, we will allow this so long as Chaldrea gives Chaldrea 15% of their lumber's profit. In addition, they will pay for any damages that may occur during the usage of our vessels. He glanced at the queen once more and reddened again, before fumbling with his paper to find his place. Andraya forced a neutral expression. Despite the ridiculousness of Bartholomew, at least Andraya had someone else in the room who shared her very young age of 18. How did he ever become a lord? A gruff voice grumbled from somewhere at the other end of the royal table. Bartholomew's head shot up, but before he could retort, Andraya cut in. Please proceed, Bartholomew. Yes, Your Majesty. He fumbled with his paper some more and continued. The Royal Council of Chaldrea has come to the conclusion that we will trade oranges for sugar with the Kingdom of Gulen. With one exception, all imports must be— Excuse me, my lord, the queen interrupted. Bartholomew paused and glanced over at her with wary eyes. Am I to understand that our late king made an agreement to trade goods with a slave-owning kingdom? Andraya couldn't quite hide her dismay. Bartholomew let out a nervous grunt. Chancellor Dolian folded his arms and cocked his head at the queen. Why else do you think the Grand Duke of Gulen would be present at our coalition meeting? He asked, his eyes daring to dance with delight at the queen's sudden shock. Andraya scanned the mostly unfamiliar faces to find the man in question. She spotted a raised finger at the far end of the table. The chubby, rusty-haired man threw her a sardonic smile. I see. Andraya said, swallowing her revulsion. "And may I ask how many in this council agree to this arrangement?" "We're long past that, my queen," Chancellor Dolian said, with a wicked smirk. "This meeting is to determine terms of trade, not if we will be trading at all." Andraya turned a sharp head in his direction and spoke in a low voice. "As my royal advisor, should this subject not have been brought to my attention prior to this meeting?" Dolian's dark eyes shimmered, knowing she was right, but clearly unrepentant. "Her Majesty has been in mourning." "I have not, sir, for 2 entire days." Just then another young man stood in haste. Andraya knew he must be a royal from Chaldrea, given his bright blonde hair and slightly tanned skin. He straightened to his full height of 6 foot. He rolled his broad shoulders back and stared at the queen with his piercing blue eyes. "Your Majesty, may I address the council?" His words sounded stiff, like they had been rehearsed precisely. "First, please introduce yourself," Andraya requested. "Prince Stefan of Chaldrea, Your Majesty." "Proceed," said the queen. Prince Stefan spoke confidently in his own Chaldrean tongue. The severe man next to Stefan stood with a wiry figure and a long face as he translated the prince's words with obvious boredom. "I agree to the terms of Chaldrea regarding the usage of Her Majesty's ships," he said, as he gestured toward Andraya. "It is a generous compromise, and Chaldrea appreciates it." Many council members shifted in discomfort. Andraya knew these men were not accustomed to gratitude of any kind in negotiations. Prince Stefan leaned over to place a hard finger up and down on the table as he spoke in earnest. The translator's inflection, however, revealed the opposite emotion. "However, I refuse to let any kingdom trade with Gulen, as their government is entirely corrupt, deceitful, and inhumane." The prince promptly sat, looking completely unashamed with his speech. The translator sat as well. "Now wait a minute!" exclaimed the Grand Duke of Gulen, as he stood abruptly, facing the Prince of Chaldrea. "Would you like to address the council, Duke?" Andraya asked, determined to maintain order. The Duke appeared irritated, but asked with an open palm, "If I may, Your Majesty." "Proceed." The plump man sniffed noisily as he buttoned his suit coat, wearing a vehement expression. He spoke in a slow, raspy voice. "Frankly, I think it ridiculous that any intelligent coalition member considers this prince's position. He can't even speak the language of Chaldrea, his own mother kingdom. We have opened trade with this miniature inconsequential island for their benefit. This man has no right to dissuade any of you from our arrangements. We may not agree on all things, but we have agreed to look past our differences, which obviously the Prince of Chaldrea is incapable of doing." The Duke plopped in his seat with a huff, just as Prince Stefan jumped out of his. Andraya held up her hand. "No, Your Highness, we've heard your side of this. It's time to hear from the other noblemen." But Prince Stefan ignored her request and spoke with urgency, his natural presence demanding attention. His translator also started to speak with some emotion. "Forgive me, Your Majesty, but trading with a government who is unprincipled in and of itself. You would know that if you were a king, and not a woman attempting to be worthy of a head crown." Andraya's heart raced with anger at this unexpected accusation, but the prince continued as if his statement were entirely regular. "How can Your Majesty possibly know the political systems when you were raised to be nothing but a mistress of a household? Surely you should leave the real business to the men of the royal courts." Prince Stefan raised his voice with abhorrence, and this time the translator followed suit. The queen shot up from her seat, utterly enraged. "I will not tolerate this!" she yelled. "You are dismissed from the council, Prince of Chaldrea, and you will no longer be allowed in this coalition." Prince Stefan disputed, but the Grand Duke of Gulen interrupted him. "And he said I was unprincipled! Hypocrite! He should be hanged for such a speech!" he shouted. "You are the hypocrite!" shouted another, "after that attempted cover-up with the Lair ship." "That was your own soldiers' fault," the Duke bellowed, leaning over the royal table and slapping it with his palm. "We are here to do business," called another. "Get a hold of yourselves, gentlemen." Andraya pounded her gavel on the table, but nobody seemed to hear, as the entire council was in chaos, with each nobleman hollering at each other as if they were at a horse race. With the exception of Bartholomew, who sat silently, staring at the paper in front of him. The queen pounded harder and yelled, "I demand order in this council!" Most quieted down, while others continued to argue at the top of their lungs. Chancellor Dolian leaned back in his seat and put his hands behind his head with a nasty grin, as if this scene pleased him tremendously. Queen Andraya turned to her 2 large guards standing at the wall behind her. "You will escort every nobleman who is not quiet at this moment out of this room and to a disciplinary chamber." Promptly they obeyed, looking delighted they had someone to manhandle. Bruce grabbed the Grand Duke of Gulen, while Hudson, the larger one, grabbed his 2 recent accusers. The others must have heard the queen's command to the guards, because they fell silent immediately. Prince Stefan also stood quiet and erect. "You will take the Prince of Chaldrea as well," Andraya ordered. Prince Stefan's eyes bulged in confusion. Andraya glared after him while Bruce dragged him out the door with the protesting duke. The queen glanced at the remaining men in the room. "Why are any of you standing?" Immediately they all sat in their seats. Andraya forced out a large breath. "This meeting is postponed until further notice," she said coolly. Then she stormed out the double doors before the footmen could open them for her. Andraya continued her haste through the palace and out into the gardens until she finally reached the long line of giant sequoias, which separated the gardens from the royal cemetery. Her deliberate steps took her a few rows ahead until she stopped short at her husband's grave. The massive headstone towered over her. Engraved into its solid surface was a strong figure of a man, flanked by soldiers. "King Gordon T. Césaire II," Andraya read aloud, "rests in peace after one short, noble year of ruling as the head crown of Chaldrea." Andraya sniffed. Noble indeed. "Just when were you going to tell me you began trading with a slave-owning kingdom, Gordon? It was all I could do to stay composed when I saw the Grand Duke of Gulen at the coalition meeting. And what a noble man he is." Andraya snorted with sarcasm. The queen paced in front of the grave as she spoke aloud. "But then again, you were very good at telling lies, now weren't you, Gordon?" She smiled at the silence that followed. "No matter," she said as she continued to pace. "I will fix this mess you put us in, even if it does mean cutting off communication with Chaldrea and their vile prince." She stopped in place. "Although, he does seem to share my aversion to slavery." Andraya shook her head. "I cannot put up with such a man." Then the queen squatted low and smiled at the headstone. "You know, Gordon, I believe this is the most pleasant conversation we have ever had. Rest well." And with that the queen stood, lifting her skirts and brushing through the sequoias once again. And that concludes Chapter 1 of Queen Andraya. I hope you come back next Thursday for Chapter 2, which is called Deceit and Desire. Every Thursday I will publish a new episode, so please come back next time. If you want to find out more about Brenda's books, you can visit brendasbooks.net. Until next time, take care.